Caleb Reese, a former Navy SEAL, had lived 10 years in silence, flying only when the quiet inside his head grew too loud. That morning, Ranger began to bark toward the fog. Through the cockpit glass, Caleb saw it. Driftwood and debris arranged on the black rocks below, spelling 3 letters: SOS. Was it a cry for help, or a trap left to be found? Should he circle back home, or break a decade of silence and land? This isn't just a story about survival. It's about loyalty, redemption, and the moment a soldier learns that some battles are worth fighting again. Subscribe and join us in honoring those who still fight unseen, men and dogs bound by duty, faith, and the silence they protect. The Pacific did not break against the Oregon coast that morning so much as breathe, long, slow, and gray. Fog lay in sheets over the water, a pale skin that dulled the world to muted pewter. The cabin sat 30 yards above the tide line, a rectangle of weathered cedar and salt-scabbed windows, its chimney coughing a tired ribbon of smoke into the damp. Inside, the clock above the sink ticked like a metronome for an absent pianist. The kettle hissed. The room smelled of coffee grounds, gun oil, and wet wool. Caleb Reese stood at the window, a broad-shouldered man of 47 with the lean, pragmatic frame of someone who had learned to carry only what he needed. His hair, once black, had surrendered at the temples to iron. A narrow seam of scar traced the line from his right ear to the hinge of his jaw, shrapnel that should have taken more. Another, meaner scar, 4 crescent bites from a violent day in a different desert, nested just beneath his collarbone. His eyes were the color of storm water and had the same steadiness, a surface that gave nothing away, a depth that did not invite sounding. He had left the teams 10 years earlier with a medal he did not wear and a name he didn't say. Yemen had taught him how silence could arrive like an order, abrupt, absolute. The mission had unraveled on a dirt airstrip that smelled of diesel and hot dust. A flash, a scream, a radio drowning in its own static. A teammate, Eli Ward, 26, left-handed, who chewed cloves when nervous, had bled out behind a blue cargo container while Caleb counted to 60 with his hand in a wound that would not close. The medevac was 5 minutes late, and the guilt was 10 years long. When the Navy shook his hand and thanked him for his service, he nodded like a man finishing a polite conversation and drove west until the ocean stopped him. Ranger padded into the doorway with the gravity of a saint entering a chapel. The German Shepherd was 8 now, big through the chest, the saddle of his coat a burnished black that drifted to dark honey along the ribs. A crescent of old scar tissue puckered the skin above his left hock, barbed wire at a border that no longer existed. His ears were high, his gaze intelligent and unsentimental. He moved with an economy learned from pain and practice, the quiet of a creature who understood that stillness could say more than noise. "Morning," Caleb said, and Ranger accepted the word like a ritual. He came to heel and pressed his flank lightly to Caleb's leg, a warm, solid gravitational pull that kept the room from drifting. The dog's breath was a slow, even metronome. When Caleb's fingers found the ridge where scar met fur, Ranger's eyes flicked up, a check, a question, a shared inventory, and then returned, satisfied, to the window's fog-dulled rectangle. The cabin's single room held a bed with an army blanket, a table rubbed to gray by salt air, a rack where a flight jacket hung like a memory too heavy to fold. A handheld radio, opened and reassembled so many times its screws were as rounded as old river stones, sat on the counter. Beside it lay a laminated grid map of the inlets and rock spines that made this stretch of coast treacherous to the uninitiated. Routine was the architecture of Caleb's days. His pen scratched tidy ticks across sectors he'd flown. His coffee cooled beside a neatly coiled length of climbing rope. If you squinted, the room looked like a prayer typed in block letters. Fog pooled between the black ribs of shoreline. Somewhere, a buoy tolled, soft as a throat clearing. Caleb drained the coffee, shouldered the jacket, and Ranger followed, nails clicking once on the floorboards, then silence. Outside, the air bit the teeth. The float plane waited in its narrow cove, red and white paint dulled by years of elemental grammar. He had bought her at an auction from a man who called her temperamental, and in a decade she had become a patience test and a refuge and an apology. They moved through their pre-flight like a remembered hymn: fuel, oil, control surfaces, harness. Caleb's hands were competent and unhurried. Ranger stood in the doorway of the hangar bay, watching the horizon as if it might misbehave. When the propeller pulled the morning into motion, Ranger climbed in, settled in the co-pilot seat, and let the engine's thrum fold over them. For Caleb, the roar was not noise. It was a wall thick enough to keep the world on the other side of it. For Ranger, it was weather, present, conscious, but not worth a bark. They rose through a skin of fog and found the light above it thin and clean. The coast unscrolled, knife-edged headlands, coves like bitten apples, the old black bones of basalt. Caleb flew a grid as precise as a man mowing the same patch of lawn for years. He marked drift lines, counted crab pots, watched for caps or hands or the wrong kind of foam. Routine was not safety, but it was close, and sometimes close was the best you could ask for. At 0817, Ranger's head lifted. It wasn't the dramatic snap of a dog with prey in his nose. It was quieter, deeper. Ears pricked, breath paused, eyes narrowing at something the human sensors had not yet named. He stood as far as the harness allowed and leaned his weight into the glass. A low hum gathered in his chest. Not a warning, not yet. Attention. What? Caleb asked, and the word fogged the cockpit for a heartbeat. He banked 5 degrees, then 10, following the dog's gaze to a scatter of rock that had no name on his map, a knuckle of basalt with a thin crescent of beach for a nail. Fog hung lower there, the color of old zinc. Ranger whined. It was a small sound, quickly strangled, the canine equivalent of a finger tapping glass, again, again. All right, Caleb said, but there was no one to hear the surrender except the dog and the engine. He put the nose down, trimmed, bled altitude, and the plane slid toward the shoal as if drawn by a line tied to its belly. The beach was more scrape than shore. Stone, kelp, the wreckage of storms sorted by a dispassionate hand. He saw it first as a smudge, then as pattern, then as language. 3 letters scrawled in driftwood and old pallets and the bleached bones of lobster crates. SOS? Not neat, not careful, but big enough to argue with the sky. A gull stood on the curve of the O, head cocked, like a witness with no testimony anyone understood. Caleb felt the old split open, duty like a lever in his chest prying against the rust of apathy. 10 years of telling himself that the ocean could keep its dead and its dramas folded nicely into the undertow. 10 years of routine as anesthesia. But the letters were a hand out of the water, and Ranger's paw pressed into the dash, steady, insistent, as if to say, we do not get to pretend. He circled once, low enough that the fog's belly tried to lick the wings. No movement on the beach, no campfire smoke, no color but gray. He set her down in a corridor of water no wider than a 2-lane road, floats hissing, fuselage shuddering when a swell disagreed with his choice. The engine's roar chopped itself into silence. The sudden lack of it made the world feel heavier. The plane rocked. Somewhere under the stern something knocked, a patient, hollow sound like a spoon against an empty bowl. Stay, he told Ranger, though the dog was already still, already listening to a spectrum of silence that included frequencies the human ear had never earned. Caleb popped the door. Cold unsheathed itself and slid into the cockpit. He tasted salt and the thin metallic edge of old fear. The beach up close was a ledger of storms, ropes braided with kelp, a cracked buoy, a single red glove stiff with salt like a hand mid-plea. The SOS was even uglier than from the air, rushed, desperate, the work of fatigue and bad tools. He walked its line, eyes moving in small, disciplined arcs. Ranger padded beside him, head low, tail at half-mast, a soldier walking point with his nose. A bottle lay against the bottom of the S, green glass crazed with salt lines. Inside, paper, not elegant parchment but torn ledger, the kind you found in a marina office. He lifted the bottle, the glass cold and gritty under his fingers. Ranger's ears twitched, not at the bottle but at the trees that began beyond the beach, a packed wall of spruce and fir. Caleb could feel the forest watching, the way a room watched when someone had left in a hurry and would not be back. The cork came out clean. The paper inside was damp along the bottom edge where Brian had found a way in. He teased it free and smoothed it against the spine of driftwood. The handwriting was hard-pressed and hurried. To whoever sees this, our boat struck something in the storm 2 nights ago. Engine dead. We drifted. Came ashore here by accident. My husband's leg is bad. No radio. The cliffs kill the signal. We left the sign on the beach. If you find this, please, north side. Inlet. The last line smeared, the ink paddling into its own panic. There were 2 names at the bottom. The second scrawled, the signature of a man writing through pain, Nora Ellis and Evan. Ranger's breath shortened by a fraction, barely sound, mostly rhythm. Caleb looked up. The forest had a cut in it, a deer path or something pretending to be. The undergrowth was flattened in the way of violence. Fern fronds crushed in a pattern that meant feet, not hooves. 10 yards into the green, a flash of color that did not belong. A blue scrap, nylon, torn from a jacket maybe, caught where a branch refused to let it pass. He folded the note and slipped it into the inner pocket of the flight jacket like a fragile heart. He did not look at the water. He did not look at the sky. He put his hand on Ranger's harness and felt the dog's heat and steadiness come up into his palm like current. North side, he said, and the trees did not answer. He tried the handheld out of habit. Static. He lifted it higher, walked 3 steps toward the rocks that slouched shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the beach. Static. The cliffs climbed around the cove like the walls of a bowl hammered by a giant who had lost interest. The geography explained the silence. The handwriting explained the rest. Memory tried to come. Yemen, dust, Eli's mouth shaping a vowel that never finished, the helicopter a dot that did not arrive. Ranger's head brushed his hand, light as a question. Caleb made a fist around nothing and felt it fill with the present. He went back to the plane and pulled the small dry bag that lived behind the seat. Tourniquet, gauze, morphine syrettes expired but probably still a mercy, headlamp, sat phone that would be a paperweight under these cliffs, a coil of paracord, knife that a man's hand remembered better than his mind. He locked the plane twice, though there was no one here to steal it but the sea. Ranger waited at the cut in the tree line, a statue made of muscle and intent. When Caleb reached him, the dog looked back once, a brief, bright glance that asked and told in the same motion. Caleb nodded. Ranger flowed into the path and the forest took them in with the small, conspiratorial rustlings of a place that had seen everything and chosen to keep its counsel. They walked until the first sound that was not the ocean found them. Something metallic in the distance, then the hush of it, as if the island had laid a finger to its lips. Caleb stopped. Ranger stopped. The world held its breath, and in that small held space, 10 years of silence rearranged themselves like furniture in a room that had waited too long to be used. The fog lifted by a finger's width. A pale band of light slid across the tops of the spruce. The beach behind them had already begun to erase their prints, as if the island preferred its stories unwritten. Caleb drew one slow breath and let it go. It left him smaller and more exact. "All right," he said to the dog and to the trees and to a memory with a name. "We're here." The ocean answered with a long exhale that sounded like a vow. The rain began as a rumor, thin threads whispering through the pines before turning to steady percussion. The forest soaked it in without complaint. Every sound felt padded, softened, as if the island itself didn't wish to wake whatever slept beneath its moss. Caleb and Ranger moved through the undergrowth like ghosts, their boots and paws sinking in the black loam. Behind them, the faint glimmer of the sea was vanishing under the fog's slow curtain. The air smelled of rust and pine sap, with an undertone of something wrong. Iron, faint and sweet. Ranger caught it first, his head tilted, nostrils flaring, tail low. Caleb stopped when he did. That was how they worked. The man's eyes scanned the direction the dog faced, but he didn't see. He never saw first. Ranger eased forward, deliberate, nose brushing the wind like he was reading invisible handwriting. Then he froze, ears stiff. Caleb followed his line and saw it, the shredded corner of a tent, green nylon faded to gray, half swallowed by a thicket of fern. He approached with the caution of a soldier disarming memory. The campsite lay in ruin, sleeping bags split, food cans rusted open, a kettle overturned in the ashes of a long-dead fire. A torn jacket flapped from a branch, its sleeves stiff with salt and time. Everything wore the same color, the gray of things that had lost their names. Ranger sniffed the ground near the collapsed tent and gave a short, sharp whine. Caleb knelt beside him. There, beneath the wet leaves, dark soil held a fresher stain. The smell rose in the rain, blood, old but not ancient. He drew a slow breath through his teeth. "Easy," he whispered, though it wasn't to calm the dog. A satchel lay half buried under a pile of driftwood. He tugged it free, the leather swollen and slippery. Inside was a waterlogged notebook wrapped in plastic film. He peeled it open with the patience of someone handling a relic. The first page clung to his thumb before releasing, revealing cramped handwriting that leaned like someone writing in a storm. Our names are Nora and Evan Ellis. The storm took the boat. The cliffs blocked the signal. We built shelter. He's hurt bad, but alive. If anyone finds this, North Inlet, please. The ink broke there, drowned in salt. Caleb stared until the words blurred into a pattern of light and shadow. His own reflection ghosted faintly on the wet page. A man made of fog and regret. 10 years collapsed into one heartbeat. He heard static that wasn't there, a radio voice fractured by sandstorms. "They're coming back. Do you copy, Bravo 2? He blinked. Rain on his lashes, not sand. Oregon, not Yemen, but the same helplessness, the same weight behind the ribs. Ranger shifted, pressing against him. The dog's warmth was a tether back to the present. Caleb shut the notebook and slipped it into his jacket. "Let's go," he said softly. They followed the faint trail beyond the camp, where the trees grew denser and the light dimmed into a kind of green twilight. Ferns brushed their legs like whispers. Twice Ranger stopped, hackles rising, eyes cutting through the mist toward movement too quiet to be the wind. Caleb lifted his rifle halfway, listening. Nothing. Only the drip of rain, then a flash. Not lightning. Metallic, low, a reflection between trunks, something or someone moving. Caleb sank to one knee, body remembering before his mind caught up. Ranger crouched beside him, eyes locked forward. A figure stood 50 yards ahead, barely visible between the trees. Human shape, still, watching. Caleb raised a hand, palm out. "Hello?" His voice came out steady, almost calm, but the forest swallowed it. The figure did not move. "U.S. Coast Guard search team," he tried, though it was a lie. "If you can hear me, I'm not armed." Another lie. The figure tilted its head slightly, like studying him. Then it turned and slipped into the deeper green, silent as breath. Caleb's pulse climbed a notch. He waited, listening for branches breaking, for retreating steps. Nothing. Only that strange, soft quiet after a presence leaves. He looked at Ranger. The dog's teeth showed in a whisper of sound, not a growl, but a note of warning. "I saw it too," Caleb said. He felt the lie of the words as soon as they left him. He hadn't seen. He'd imagined shapes in fog before. He'd talked to ghosts before. But Ranger didn't imagine. Ranger never lied. They moved toward where the figure had been. The ground sloped down to a shallow clearing where water pooled among roots. There, half hidden in the mud, a trail of prints, bare feet, small, leading toward the cliffs. He crouched, touching one. Fresh. Rain had filled the edges, but not long enough to erase them. Human. Alive. For a moment, relief and dread argued in his chest. Someone survived, but if they survived, who had bled? The wind shifted, bringing the smell stronger now. Blood, salt, and something chemical, metallic. Ranger's muzzle wrinkled. He gave a low bark once. Echo answered somewhere ahead. Caleb looked up. The sky through the canopy had gone darker, not from weather, but from the hour turning. Day slipping into the throat of evening. He lifted the radio from his belt, keyed the mic. "Base, this is..." Static swallowed the rest. He tried again. "Anyone copy?" Only static. He raised the antenna, stepped into a patch of open ground, tried once more. The same hiss. Then, under it, something. Half a word? A voice. Far away. "Back." He froze. Turned the dial, pulse in his ears. The voice came again, fractured, ghost-like. "They're back." He dropped the radio. It hit the mud with a dull slap. Ranger pressed close, eyes on him, waiting for command. Caleb swallowed hard, forcing air back into his lungs. "It's interference," he muttered. "Old frequency." But his voice didn't believe it. For a long moment they stood like that, man and dog, motionless in a cathedral of trees, while the rain hissed its endless sermon. He thought of Yemen again, the crack of gunfire under a dead sky, Eli's hand slipping from his grip, the silence after. Back then he hadn't gone back. He'd followed orders. He'd lived. Now, a different silence surrounded him, this one asking, not ordering. He looked toward the north cliffs, where fog bled upward like smoke from something still burning. "If they're alive," he whispered, "we find them." Ranger flicked an ear, then started forward, muscles moving under wet fur like tide beneath sand. Caleb followed. Behind them, the abandoned camp sagged into the rain, the fire pit filling with water. The notebook's imprint pressed damp against Caleb's chest, warm from his body heat, beating faintly in rhythm with his heart. As they climbed higher, thunder rolled from far out at sea, a low, patient sound like a door opening miles away. Caleb paused at the ridge, turned once toward the shore. Through the thinning mist, he could just see the faint line of their plane bobbing on the gray water. For a second he thought he saw movement near it, a silhouette against the fuselage, but the fog closed again before certainty could form. He breathed out slowly. "Breathe, Reese," he told himself, echoing words his team leader used to say. "Fear's just proof you're still in the fight." Ranger stopped beside him, eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. The wind came cold from that direction, carrying a new scent, smoke, faint and human. Caleb looked up into the bruised sky. Looks like someone's still awake. And somewhere between thunder and the first drop of night, he felt the old part of himself, the one that followed orders, the one that killed, stir again like an animal remembering hunger. Dusk came on like a bruise, purple soaking through the canopy, the rain tapering to a fine needled drift that hung in the air and glittered against the firelight. Caleb built the blaze small and clean, a soldier's fire, tucked behind a boulder and a screen of wet brush so its light wouldn't travel. He boiled water, the tin cup clicking softly against the rock with each stir. The camp they'd found had been too exposed. This hollow gave him a backstop and two narrow lanes of approach. Ranger chose his post without being told, 30 feet offset, facing the darker timber where scent and sound pooled. The dog's chest rose and fell in measured counts, but his eyes did not blink. The first sound was not footsteps, but a body meeting ground, the clumsy slide of weight on wet needles, followed by a breath sucked through teeth. Ranger's head came up. Caleb's hand went to the pistol at his hip and then stayed there, still and ready. "Help!" a voice called, not loud, not whispering, just raw. "Please." He stepped out of the light and into the border of shadow, placing the fire at his back so it washed whatever came forward. The man crawled into the glow like something shipwrecked by land, 40 maybe, with a sailor's tan gone gray under the rain. His hair was plastered to his skull, his beard a week past decision. He wore an expensive jacket chewed by brine and rock, and his right pant leg was soaked dark to mid-thigh. He lifted his hands, palms out. "Don't shoot," he said. The voice was sanded down by salt and fear. "Name's Jonas. My wife—" He swallowed the rest. "We were blown in. There were men. They took— I think she's—" His face collapsed, then struggled back into a shape that could be looked at. Ranger's lips barely moved. A sound like a hinge rusting open vibrated in the dog's throat. "Sit," Caleb said to the dog, and to the man. "Let me see the leg." Jonas nodded fast, relief like steam rising off him. He rolled to one hip and shoved fabric up. The wound was ugly and honest, deep along the outer thigh, the kind that came from a blade, not a bullet. The bleeding had slowed to an ooze. Around it, skin was clean in a hard rectangle where something had been tied tight for hours. Caleb peeled his glove with his teeth, set the kit down. He worked the way he had been taught to work when someone was dying. Efficient, merciless. Irrigation, gauze, pressure, wrap. He poured antiseptic straight into the cut. Jonas bowed up on a sound that didn't ask permission to exist. His fists dug trenches in the loam. Then he collapsed, panting, shocky and sweating. Caleb taped the tail, sat back on his heels. "That will hold," he said. Ranger did not take his eyes off the man. Jonas blinked tears or rain. "Thank you," he said. The words seemed strange in his mouth, like he hadn't used them enough. Caleb gave him the tin cup. "Sip." Jonas drank and shuddered and set the cup down with both. Hands like he didn't trust his thumbs. The fire braided little snakes of light up his cheeks. "She's gone," he said, staring at the flames. "Nora, they shot. I couldn't— The storm. I tried." "The men?" Caleb asked. "Smugglers? The kind that smile when they hurt you?" Jonas's laugh was a thin string pulled too tight. "We lit a fire, waved. They came, not to help." He looked at Caleb like he wanted him to fill in the rest. "Gunfire in the squall. She fell. I ran." "Which way?" "Up, away." He gestured vaguely toward dark. I hid until the rain softened their noise. Caleb let the story settle. He watched how the man moved inside it, which parts he furnished with detail and which he left empty. The sequence stuttered in small places. The storm had been a blunt instrument. This version of it was neat. Ranger shifted 5 degrees. He wasn't watching Jonas now. He was watching the space behind Jonas, the dark there as if it were a living thing. Food, Caleb said. He tossed a foil packet across. Jonas flinched, then tore into it with a hunger too clean for someone who hadn't eaten in days. They kept a small talk measured in grunts. Caleb asked for names. Jonas offered them like ballast, his wife's, a harbor he swore he was aiming for when the engine died. He said, engine, like a man who owned the word but not the tool. He said, shot, like he'd learned the taste of it from a movie. Radio? Caleb asked. Dead, Jonas said. Then quickly, we tried it. The cliffs kill it. Caleb said nothing. His own radio lay on the rock beside him, mute and self-important. He would test it again at dawn from the beach. The hour in the air could change what the sky decided to carry. Night folded itself neatly around them. The rain stopped arguing and became a damp heresy that clung to sleeves and the back of the neck. Fire ticked down to coals. Jonas's breathing threaded through sleep, or something close to it, light, performative, full of careful groans. Caleb knew the sound of men pretending to be more hurt than they were, and men pretending to be less. He sorted it and filed it. Ranger did not bother with files. He stood the way old statues stand, like the object of their attention had made a mistake being born. Once, Jonas stirred and smiled weakly at the dog. Good boy, he said, voice sweetened by need. He flicked a piece of ration toward Ranger. Ranger looked at the food as if it were an equation and then turned his head 1 inch away, a gesture of contempt so simple it felt like language. Jonas's hand hovered midair, then fell. He doesn't like me. He doesn't like anyone, Caleb said. It wasn't true. Cloud ran ragged over a sliver moon. In that brief white wash, something ordinary became strange. Caleb's gaze fell to Jonas's boot, the uninjured side. Along the outer edge of the sole, a line of dried brown had caught in the seam. Not the dark wet bloom of the thigh wound. This was older, scabbed into the leather. There were grains embedded in it that glittered faintly, salt, sand, and a smear the color of diesel on the welt. He pictured the path they'd taken, the way the man had arrived crawling on needles, not wading through the cove. The blood on the boot did not belong to that journey. Caleb kept his face quiet and his body still. He let a long minute pass, then stood as if to stretch. He walked into the trees in a lazy semicircle a scout would recognize as anything but lazy. He bent where rain gathered, scooped a palm, sniffed, diesel, fresh. He raised his head. On the bark of a spruce 3 feet from where Jonas had first slid into sight, something had scraped a narrow, bright line, paint or enamel. He put a thumb to it and came away with a fleck of blue, boat locker blue, hardware store padlock blue. Above it, the bark had a faint scar like a rope had kissed it under strain. Ranger ghosted to him and pressed a shoulder into his knee. The dog's nostrils fluttered, catching the same braid of smells. Man, salt, machine. Back at the fire, Jonas's eyes were half-lidded in the way of men who are not asleep but want to be looked at gently. You going? He murmured. Checking perimeter, Caleb said. He reseated himself on the rock with the care of someone whose joints had opinions. He could feel the chapter line of a choice opening under his feet, the place where a man divides into 2 men, the one who accepts and the one who verifies. Tell me about the shot, Caleb said after a while, the one that took her. Jonas swallowed. Loud, he said. Close. Caliber? Jonas blinked. What? Never mind. Caleb fed the fire a little stick and watched how Jonas's eyes followed the flame. Men who had seen a life go out watched fire differently. Where were you hit? Caleb asked softly. Jonas's hand went automatically to the wrapped thigh. Here. Before or after she fell? He stared into the coals. After. Then how did her blood get on your left boot? Jonas looked up. For one naked heartbeat, the performance fell away. Something cold and hard stared out through his face. Then he laughed a small, breathless laugh and tugged at the wrap. Blood goes where it wants, he said. It was raining. Ranger stepped closer to Jonas by a single pace, not toward him, but between him and Caleb, and sat. The dog's body was a line drawn across the ground, a quiet, living barricade. Caleb's hand felt very far away from his gun and at the same time already around it. He stayed still. The night had changed key. Even the insects seemed to tune themselves to a lower register. Somewhere far to the north, a sound rose. The ocean had turned from lecture to threat. Between the gusts, another noise stitched itself in, a faint, rhythmic thump. Not thunder, not wave, hollow, metallic, a fist on a bulkhead, once, twice, 3 times, a pause, then again. Jonas flinched in the wrong direction, not toward the sound, toward the dark where a line of trees hid the way down to the northern coves. "You hear that?" Caleb asked. "No," Jonas said too quickly. The thumping stopped as if it had remembered itself. Silence filled its outline. Caleb stood. The decision that had been forming in him since the bottle at the beach hardened into something like purpose. He picked up the radio and, knowing it would fail, pressed transmit anyway, more for the muscle memory than for hope. Static answered, steady and clean, the kind that meant the world wanted you to solve your own problems. "We move at first light," he said, "toward the north inlet." Jonas's jaw worked. "No," he said, the word too naked by half. "We should go south. Your plane, we move at first light," Caleb repeated, as if the night itself had asked. He turned to the dog. "Watch." Ranger did not look at him. He didn't need to. His gaze was pinned to Jonas with the patient ferocity of a guardian angel who had decided he believed in only one soul in the camp. Caleb doused the fire until the last ember lost its orange. Night poured in and took back what was its. He lay with his pack under his head and the notebook against his chest and the pistol under his palm. He closed his eyes in slices, 5 seconds at a time, listening to men and trees breathe. Sometime in the hour when the mind softens, a small light bloomed low in the forest, no higher than a man's knee, bobbing twice, then gone. A signal, a test, or a mistake. Ranger snapped to his feet with no sound at all, every hair along his spine standing like a field of grass under a sudden wind. His head turned not to the light, but to Jonas, and what lived in the dog's eyes then was not warning and not threat. It was recognition. Caleb's breath stayed slow because he made it slow. He raised himself on one elbow, found Jonas's silhouette in the dark. The man was no longer slumped. He was leaning forward, weight on his hands like a sprinter waiting for a pistol. Between them, the dog did not move. He looked larger than he was. He looked like the idea of a dog, loyalty given a skeleton and teeth. Caleb's gaze dropped, a habit he couldn't break, to details. On Jonas's injured leg, the bandage held. On his uninjured boot, the dried brown in the welt had cracked with heat from the fire. The pieces flaked like old varnish, and beneath them the true color showed in the briefest knife of moon, not brown. The dried purple-black of arterial blood, not his. Somewhere out beyond the trees, the bulkhead thumped again, once, tired, human. Caleb slid his hand to the radio and to the gun in one slow, unhurried motion, as if smoothing a blanket. He spoke so softly that only the animal could hear. "At dawn," he whispered, and Ranger's ear flicked, but his eyes never left the man who had called himself survivor. The wind shifted and brought in the sour bite of diesel. It smelled like a lie. And in that smell, and the dog's unmoving shadow, and the distant, patient knocking of someone who refused to be forgotten, the night opened and the story turned. The storm had walked off in the night and left its bones behind, wet ropes of cloud snagged on the treetops, a chill that lived in the sleeves, the sound of water ticking from every needle and leaf. Dawn came in on the color of pewter. Caleb and Ranger moved through the dim like they were part of it, not cutting it, but belonging to it. Behind them, the camp was just a bruise in the forest floor. Ahead, the island exhaled a slow, metallic breath that carried diesel and salt and the faint, sour note of men. They didn't take the trail. Ranger quartered the slope with a hunter's patience, nose writing in the invisible ink of air. The dog's gait changed when he took the scent, shoulders down, tail a level wire, breath measured. Caleb matched him, boots soft on the black loam. This was their language. He spoke with weight shifts and the angle of his rifle. Ranger answered with pauses and looks. Between them hung a quiet that had learned to keep both of them alive. The trees thinned into a gash of light. A wind-scoured cut in the ridge opened into a shelf of rock and rust. Below, half buried in beach stone, stood a low structure that had once been a boathouse and was now a held breath. Tin roof bowed, gray boards silvered by salt. A door chained shut with a hardware store lock the color of cheap sconce. The tide had licked its pilings for decades. Crab shells and broken trapwire braided the threshold like a forgotten prayer. Ranger stopped at the entrance and waited. Caleb put 2 fingers to the chain. Salt had made a crust the key would never forgive. He pulled a pry bar from his pack and set the bite. A twist, a groan, the small, angry cry of a staple leaving wood. The lock fell with a soft, final weight. He eased the door inward, and the dark inside breathed out at them. Cold, trapped air that smelled of rope, bilge, wet paper, mouse. They let their eyes learn it. Sun came in through holes in the tin, laying ragged ladders on the floor. Nets slumped in heaps, oars stacked like bones, a skiff upside down under a tarp, and against the back wall, above a workbench built by a man whose hands had faith in straight lines, a set of cabinets, steel, dented, each drawer labeled in a hand that cared about letters, charts, spare plugs, fuel, and one with no label at all. Ranger stood along the left wall, not touching the floor with his weight, as if the boards had a memory he didn't want to wake. His ears turned toward the sea and then back to Caleb, checking, anchoring. Caleb nodded once, the small permission that meant we're here. We do this, we leave. He put his palm on the unlabeled drawer. Cold, he pulled. It stuck, then surrendered an inch at a time with the sound of old paint arguing. Inside lay what had no place in a boathouse. Manila folders held by string, a cigar tin with a cracked hinge, a photograph wrapped in waxed paper, a small, square notebook with oil thumbprints on its cover. The top folder was stamped with a company mark he knew. From a lifetime of airports and documentaries, a star that wasn't a star, a name that had once meant airplanes that outran their own legends. Lockheed. The room tipped a degree, not the world. Caleb. His hand didn't shake, but it wanted to. He broke the string. Pages whispered like old leaves, diagrams with the spare beauty of the kind drawn by men who think in clean lines. A map of the Oregon coast, latitude and longitude like a skeleton beneath it. In the margins, a hand had written small notes in pencil: propagation shadow, multipath null, cliff attenuation. Someone had been designing silence, not the simple stubborn silence of bad luck and rock, a bowl of quiet built on purpose. He turned the page and found a sheet of letterhead with 2 names at the bottom, typed, one struck through by hand, the surviving name he didn't know, the one torn by a single stroke of graphite he knew in his ribs the way you know the shape of your own scar. Dr. Alistair Reese. The paper made a sound when his thumb tightened, a sound like thin bone. He set it down with the care of a man lowering a flag. He reached for the photograph in waxed paper and let it find sky. 4 men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a chain-link fence in a test range that had made the air look far away. One was tall and clean, the kind of handsome that cameras work to please. One had the stoop of men who read at drafting tables. One wore a grin he used like a business card. The 4th was younger than Caleb remembered him ever being. Wind-bent hair, a tie that refused to lay flat, eyes that looked everywhere and then at the camera last. His father. There was the star that wasn't a star on a jacket sleeve. There was a chalkboard behind them with a sketch that looked like a cliff and a wave and a radio wave that died before the cliff let it live. On the back, someone had written a date from a year that used to feel like the future and a line in a small, tidy hand. Prototype achieved. Field test, Blackrock. He felt the old room shorten and lengthen around him, as if the boathouse was breathing with him. Ranger came up softly and pressed his nose into Caleb's wrist, a touch no harder than a thought. The dog inhaled slow through his mouth the way he did when he was trying to take in the whole of a scent, not the parts. His eyes were steady. He didn't know the word father. He knew the weight in Caleb's body had changed. Caleb opened the cigar tin. Inside lived a few hardware store keys, a burnt match, and a laminated badge with a photograph punched through the corner. The man in the badge was the tall, handsome one from the group shot, older by a little and thinner in the way men get when they stop eating for reasons that look like work. Arthur Dane, systems contractor, under the name in small letters, Aegis Maritime. The back bore a number and a single line typed in without poetry. Temporary, until name clearance. He paged deeper into the folder. There were memos with parts blacked out by a pen that thought it was paint. There were line items with numbers that didn't fit the stated purpose of research into shoreline interference phenomena. There was a hand-drawn map of this island, this exact cliff, this exact cove, this exact blind spot, and at the bottom margin, a note written in the same neat pencil. If deployed commercially, this becomes a weapon. Another hand had written over it, arrogant and blue, only if used badly. He could hear his father's voice for one instant in the dry air, not the words but the cadence of a man trying to make sense, make peace with money. We make tools. People choose what to build with them. Not this, Caleb murmured to no one living. He felt Ranger's head lift to his face, searching for a command in the shape of his breath. He gave none. He turned to the square notebook and opened it in the middle, the way you do when you are afraid of both the first and the last page. Most of it was practical. The length of cable, the angle of a roof, the depth of a trench to bury conduit in the dark. Between those, small human sentences written like someone tearing paper carefully so it still matched if you pushed the halves together. Reese pushed for attribution, told him we'd lose the contract. He said, then we lose it. He doesn't know how the game is played, or he does and won't play it. Prototype works too well. Cliff Cup dead at Duro 10 made heads bleeds to VHF, Coast Guard unhappy if they knew, but nobody knows unless we tell them. Dane said, you designed the lock, not the thief. Reese said, you don't sell the lock to the thief. The last pages were spare and then stopped. A receipt paperclipped to the back cover was from a funeral home inland, neat and merciless. Alistair Reese in printed letters, and a date that came before Yemen, before a radio whisper said, they're coming back, and a part of Caleb never did. He stood without realizing it. The roof hissed as something soft began to fall again, mizzle too fine to name as rain. Ranger shifted so that their shoulders touched. Caleb put his palm on the dog's neck and felt the warm, steady engine there, the pulse of a creature that understands loyalty as an act without an audience. You and me, he said, not as comfort but as geometry. 2 lines, same direction. The boathouse had one more voice. In the bottom of the drawer, under the notebook, lay a plastic sleeve with a photograph that hadn't belonged in any file at all. Too personal, too domestic, too tender. A kitchen table lit by winter morning. A boy with a cowlick staring at a metal puzzle like it had insulted him. A man leaning in, chin stubble, eyes bright with the joy men forget to have when they get good at their jobs. The man's hands made a bridge over the puzzle, and the boy's hands were inside that bridge, small, safe. Caleb sat down on the bench before his knees decided to without his permission. He had not remembered that shirt. He had not remembered that bruise on his shin. He remembered the problem, how to twist the 2 rings apart. He remembered the laugh when he did it, the way the sound had surprised his father like it was a bird landing on his shoulder. Outside, the sea changed voice again, lower now. Patient the way cliffs are patient. Somewhere to the north, a gull cried in a way that made the sound look like a thread thrown and pulled back. The island's silence held. On another shelf, a small AM set slept under a rag. He lifted it and thumbed the wheel out of habit. Static came up like wind through tall grass, and then an instant of something that wasn't random. Not a word. A rhythm. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Not from the air, from the radio's own injured heart. Or from memory. He shut it off. He set it down. He looked at the Lockheed stamp and the struck-through name and the pencil notes about the ethics of bowls of quiet. There were men out there on the rocks who would use a tool like this to turn the world into a place where women cried and no one heard it. There had been men, sharp, shy, principled, who had built the tool for other reasons. One of them had been his father. One of them had died without the line that says inventor of ever appearing where it should have. A thought rose and did not go away. There are people who fight all their lives not to be remembered, but to let the world stay so quiet other people can forget. He felt something in him yield, not break. A hinge that had been rusted for years took oil. Ranger made a small sound like assent and laid his head on Caleb's boot. His weight said, I am here in a grammar older than vows. Caleb gathered what he could carry, the notebook, the photograph, the badge with Dane's name, the map with a penciled circle around the north inlet, and slid the drawer shut on what he could not. He chained the door again, not to keep thieves out, but to put the dark back where it belonged. On the threshold, he looked once more at the place his father's name had been, and then hadn't, at the line of graphite that had erased a man with the softness of snow. "Okay," he said to the room, to the island, to a ghost. "We'll build the noise where it needs to be." He and the dog stepped into the pearled light. The sea had ironed itself to dull silk. On the far rim of sky, the storm remembered them and began to turn back. At his feet, Ranger shifted, ready to track. Caleb touched the dog's ear with 2 fingers, and the animal leaned his whole head into that small contact like a man laying down a burden. Somewhere beyond the trees, something kept knocking, patient, human, refusing to be folded into the silence. Caleb's jaw set. He followed the sound, carrying with him a name struck through and a life that wouldn't be. And in a morning the color of old steel, the path ahead looked like a sentence without a period. The day sharpened by degrees, like a blade pulled slow across a whetstone. Clouds thinned without breaking. The air had the taste of coin. Ranger moved ahead in a steady, unsentimental line, tail level, head low. The dog was less an animal than an instrument reading a field no other sensor could see. Caleb followed at a distance that had become ritual, close enough to lay a hand if the world went loud, far enough not to step on the message the nose was reading. They climbed through a corridor of spruce where the light fell in mown gray planks. Somewhere to the north, the ocean worked on rock with the patient energy of a blacksmith. The smell rode each draft, salt, diesel, and under it, the iron-sweet thread Ranger had chosen from the air and would not let go. The sign was where the forest bent its head in a small hollow. Ranger stopped with his left paw lifted, the way he did when the invisible became particular. Caleb saw nothing, then saw it all at once. A pile that wanted to be a bush and failed. Fresh-cut fir boughs laid too neat, leaves from a different floor. He knelt and pulled, resin sang on the air, and beneath the smell of green lived the older smell the rain couldn't clean, blood gone brown at the edges. He worked with one hand while the other never forgot the gun. The boughs gave, then the leaves. His knuckle dragged wet cloth. He cleared enough to know. Oiled canvas, the kind sailors love, cut into a jacket and used like a second weather. It was heavy with water, and with the weight water hides. He spread it on the dirt. A dark bloom stained the left shoulder to the breast, dried to a purplish black in the seams. The pattern told a story even if the mouth refused. High entry, slow bleed, carried by a man who kept moving until someone else hid the evidence for him. Ranger made a sound that wasn't a growl and wasn't a whine, just a low, disapproving note of recognition. Caleb put 2 fingers into the torn oval and felt the cloth's crust. He smelled the memory stitched there, salt, fear, the tin bite of a bulkhead air left too long without a window. North, he said. He didn't need to. Ranger was already going. The trees steepened into a gulch cut like a throat. They dropped through it, the ground underfoot treacherous with moss-slick stone. The sound that had been suggestion became statement, a slow, hollow thump, spaced like a heartbeat that had learned patience the hard way. It came from rock that opened to a private inlet no map would have admitted, a pocket of black water chewed by white teeth. The boat lay there the way shipwrecks kneel when they are too proud to lie flat, bow kissed into boulder, stern listing, paint scraped to bone. A cabin door had been chained from the outside and blessed by a padlock, the color of a lie. Ranger took the last 10 feet in 3 smooth steps, his claws finding purchase where a man would slip. Caleb timed his descent with the breath of the sea, jump when it inhaled, land when child. It held, and reached the transom without a sound louder than a boot sole on wet plank. The first slam on the bulkhead came as he touched the hasp, a tired, deliberate knock that asked to exist. "Hold," he told the dog, hand cutting the air. Ranger flowed into shadow and became a shape the mind decided was part of the hull. Caleb tested the lock and knew it would break if persuaded correctly. The pry bar went under the hasp, took a breath, and leaned. The wood sighed and surrendered. He caught the door as it kicked and eased it back so the hinges didn't betray. Diesel, mildew, stale panic, air like a bad memory. "Nora," he said into the dark, voice low, voice sure. "I'm here." Silence, then the smallest scrap of a voice. "Please." The flashlight went on like a star with manners. The beam slid over a table bolted to a floor that tried to forget it was moving, over a net of rope that had seen the wrong work, over a triangle of space cut by a V-berth door. The scratching came from there, a dull plastic cable tie whirring against itself. He kicked the flimsy door and it agreed with him in a shower of splinters. She was where men who didn't want to look at their own acts put their acts, small, bound, taped, eyes swollen by more than salt. The face under the grime had the shape of someone who'd learned to be practical and been punished for it. Her shirt had torn at one shoulder. She was shaking in a way that wasn't cold. He holstered, knelt, and cut the tape at the wrist first, the way you do when you've had to tell people later why their hands are purple. "I'm Caleb," he said. "We're leaving." The tape at her mouth came off with a sound like a wound. "He's alive," she said, the words falling over each other. "Not who he said. Jonas, he isn't my husband. Evan is. Evan fought him." "Where is your husband?" Caleb cut the ankle ties. She sucked air and tried to stand. Her legs forgot. He caught her at the ribs, felt the hot engine of fever under skin. "Where?" "On the rocks," she said. "They moved him when you flew over. They hit him when the sound came. Please, he's burning up." The deck rang with a sound that didn't belong to the ocean. A foot. Quiet. Wrong. Ranger was a statue with a pulse, head canted, ears laid back, every cell aimed at the doorway to the world. Caleb lifted the pistol and the flashlight together and wrote a line of light along the hatch. "Easy," a voice said from outside, almost conversational, as if complimenting the weather. "You've got me all wrong." Jonas stepped into the frame. He carried a narrow knife and a smile too tired to be friendly. The bandage at his thigh was clean and white, tied by careful hands that had counted minutes. His eyes were the color men's get when money stops being theory. "You should have stayed with me," he said. "Things could have been tidy." Ranger's growl rose an inch. No more. The dog did not move because Caleb had not yet written the verb in the air. "Put the knife down," Caleb said. "Broad daylight kind. We can take the boat off the rocks when the tide turns. There's room for all of us." Jonas laughed the laugh of a man who could spell mercy but not define it. "There's room for one story," he said. "It was mine. You took it." He came fast because men who cut for a living understand the value of speed over anger. Caleb was already moving, the pistol half-holstered in a decision he wouldn't explain later, the flashlight hand becoming bone and leverage. The gun barrel bit into Jonas's wrist. The knife moved in a bright, shallow arc and kissed Caleb under the ribs through the jacket, shallow enough to deny drama, deep enough to inform. Heat ran under the shirt. "Get," he started. "Him," he finished, but the dog was already airborne, a low, gray shape breaking from the shadow like a promise. Ranger didn't go for the blade or the throat. He crashed his whole 90 pounds into Jonas's bandaged leg with the indifference of physics. Something gave with a sound meant for a different room. Jonas folded, the knife skipping into the scuppers, bright and suddenly unimportant. Caleb's vision narrowed to a grain of light and then widened out again in a wave. He put a knee into Jonas's shoulder and put the pistol where a thought would live in a smarter man. Jonas tried to find the smile again and found only teeth. "Where?" Caleb said between the ocean's breaths. "Is Evan?" "Already gone," Jonas panted, the words smearing. "Dead this morning. Shame." His gaze flicked, not toward the inlet or the boat's bow, but toward the cliff above, the seam of rock that broke in a narrow chimney and led to a shelf you'd have to be desperate or inhuman to climb. Ranger's head turned that way in the same second. Agreement in two species. Caleb drew a fast breath that burned and holstered, cable-tied Jonas's wrists with hands that hadn't forgotten the angle, then a second loop around ankle and rail. He was not gentle. Jonas tried for one last piece of theater. You made it worse, and got silence for his trouble. "Watch," Caleb told the dog, and to Nora, "Can you move?" She nodded too fast. He believed the nod, not the body. "We go slow," he said. The wound under his ribs was a warm coin now, a reminder he could live with later. They climbed into a world that had been waiting to see if they'd try. The chimney was a bracket of wet rock and bad decisions. Caleb went first, placing hands where he'd teach a boot to go later. He hauled Nora with a rope looped under her arms and around his back so he could carry and climb at once. Twice he slipped and recovered on the memory of men who had been behind him once and were not now. Ranger was a gray current at his shoulder, rising with a clean economy no human could copy. Every 10 feet the dog checked his face as if to confirm the math still added up. The wind increased in small, angry bites near the top. A shelf cut into the cliff like a ledge after a thought. On it, a shape lay wrong under a tarp. Caleb crawled the last 2 yards, pulled the canvas back, and met a face that had been burning a long time and had decided, for now, not to leave. "Evan," Nora said, the syllables breaking. She went to her knees beside him, hands shaking so hard her fingers made a sound in the fabric. The bandage at his calf was dirty but honest, the fever in him high enough to find even in the wind. Caleb cut the old ties. He poured the last of the clean water down the man's throat a mouthful at a time. Evan swallowed like a machine that needed a mechanic's touch and remembered how. Color returned, first to the lips, then to a line along the cheekbones. His eyes opened and focused in stages, landing finally on Nora's mouth where he found his name. "Hey," he said, and turned the word into a gentleness. Below them, from the boat, came a bellow like iron arguing with engine. Jonas was trying to make the story move again. The motor coughed, failed, caught, coughed. Ranger's ears snapped toward the sound and then back to Caleb, the question clean in the angle of his body. "We're done with him," Caleb said. He wasn't sure if he was lying. The pain under the rib had spread to an idea. He cinched Evan to his own back with the rope in a scrap of climbing they teach to men who will one day need to carry other men who used to carry themselves. Nora went beside, one hand on Evan, one on Rock. Ranger led with quick checks over the shoulder, keeping their path inside his understanding of safe. The forest took them again, the shelf behind, the inlet now just a bowl of noise under their feet. They reached the trees as the light decided what color to be. Caleb eased Evan onto a bed of fern, and the man slept because his body had made the decision a long time ago and waited for permission. Nora folded herself down with him, hands still on him like she was telling his muscles not to forget the shape they needed. Ranger returned from a slow, deliberate circle and lay with his body between the sleeping and the world. He placed his chin on his paws with the ceremony of a vow. The dog's breath was a metronome the forest agreed to. Caleb pressed a hand under his coat and found the heat that wasn't air. He pulled the jacket aside and saw the thin mouth of the cut under his ribs, a red sentence fragment. It had bled, and it had stopped. He wiped it once, felt the sting that proved he was still in the room, and taped it shut with the last of a roll that had seen men in worse shape and done enough for them to get to a place that could finish the work. Down the hill, the engine gave up its argument and failed. The island remembered how to be quiet. In that quiet, he set a flare, not as signal, the cliffs were still a doctrine, but as light. A small red sun threw its circle over the three of them, and the dog, painting their faces with a color that made them look like someone else might be able to find them. Smoke climbed and became a ribbon the wind couldn't quite steal. The flare burned down, hissed, and went to a wire-thin coal. Evening took the rest. Nora's hand found Caleb's sleeve. "Why did you come back?" she whispered. He watched Ranger's ears follow a sound only he could hear and felt the dog's attention reach out like a hand. He thought of a name struck out on a page, of boys with puzzles and men with tools, and the way silence can be used as jail or mercy depending on who owns it. "Because someone was still knocking," he said. They sat in the breathing dark with the smell of burned salt and the red ghost of the flare hanging in the air. The boat's noise gone, the ocean working as it always would. Pain lived under the tape and hope lived inside the dog's slow breath. The night, for once, did not close like a door. It stayed open an inch, enough for a promise to pass. The forest remembered the gunfire the way a body remembers fever, by the hush that follows. Smoke hung low among the trunks, shredded by wind into gray ribbons that snagged on bark and vanished. The flare's red ghost still haunted the needles. Somewhere below, the ocean worked on stone like nothing had happened at all. Jonas lay on his side, hands cinched at the spine with plastic cuffs, the shotgun kicked into a fern bed where it looked embarrassed to be seen. He had the ruin of a man who'd argued with physics and lost. Nora, under a mylar blanket, watched him from a distance that wasn't measured in feet. Evan breathed in slow, ragged stitches beside her, fever falling by degrees. Caleb stood with his hand on a tree to keep the world from tilting, feeling the ache under his ribs pulse with its own metronome. Ranger sat to his left, the dog's shoulder fur matted and black with a shallow crease, a compromise the night had taken when he moved between muzzle flash and the man who made it. "Let me see," Caleb said. Ranger tolerated the hand with a stoic blink, the way he did at the vet, present, braced, forgiving. The pellet had kissed muscle and gone on to frame the air, blood clotted in a tidy crescent. Caleb, irrigated with what was left of clean water, packed a strip of gauze, wrapped tight. The dog exhaled through his nose like he was allowing it. "Good boy," Caleb said. The words were small. The weight behind them wasn't. Nora's eyes were glass bright in the dim. "You didn't shoot him?" she said, voice frayed by exhaustion and the new shape of relief. Caleb didn't answer. He could still feel the trigger's edge under his finger, the way the sight had married Jonas's face. The clean math of a solution solved a certain way. He could still feel Ranger's gaze, an old stubborn mercy set in amber, and how it had found the wire in him that refused to break. Jonas laughed once, a sound wrapped in gauze. "You people," he said, "you always want the world to clap." "Nobody's clapping," Caleb said. He knelt, checked the cinch. "You're going to live. That's the consequence." Jonas rolled his head toward the black water below. "It's a big island," he said. "You think you can keep us all on one side of a story?" "Long enough," Caleb said. His breath caught on the cut. He didn't show it to the room. Silence took the edges back. Crickets tuned themselves to a lower key. Evan's fever sweat cooled. The flare's ash went to nothing in the wet soil. Ranger settled closer, leaning a quiet, significant ounce of weight against Caleb's boot, the way a friend in a church pew lets his shoulder touch yours at a funeral, not to be seen, only to be felt. The dog's breath paced the dark. Caleb let his hand rest on Ranger's crown and thought of a name struck out on letterhead, of a photograph wrapped in wax paper, of diagrams in a drawer that explained why radios died in this particular sabbateh. "Throat of rock, bowls of quiet," his father had written in another man's notebook. "Locks you don't sell to thieves." The gunfight ended in front of him. The larger one was an old war with a longer front. "Sleep," he told Nora. "Both of you. We move at first light." She didn't argue. Her eyes slid shut in the helpless way of people whose bodies finally overrule their fear. Evan's hand found hers even in sleep and held. Jonas said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would be believed. Caleb waited through the middle hours, the ones that turned men into worse or better versions of themselves. He rotated the ache under his ribs like a coin in a pocket, testing edges. He counted the seconds between Ranger's breaths. Twice the dog raised his head, ears toward a hush that meant 2 legs, not 4, and twice the hush drifted away. Somewhere, the ocean changed mood. The wind traded places in the trees. When he finally let his eyelids slide, 5 seconds, then 10, he dreamed of a kitchen table and a metal puzzle, of a laugh that had startled his father like a miracle. Woke to the dog's nose touching his wrist, a pulse check, a tap back to the present. Dawn came thin and pale, like a letter opened carefully. Mist lifted in sheets. The forest reassembled itself out of gray. Caleb eased Jonas to his feet with a tug on the cuffs, walked him to a fallen log, and lashed him there with rope he did not remember uncoiling. He stripped the man's pockets, a folding knife with a bone handle, a Zippo with an oil company logo, a flat plastic card in a waterproof sheath, the kind contractors clip to lanyards when they want doors to like them. The card was stamped Aegis Maritime, temporary access, and embossed with a frequency table and 4 short strings of numbers next to tiny symbols, a buoy, a horn, a beacon, a compass rose. On the back, in a hand that wrote contracts for a living, Borrow 400, South Beacon, tender. Salt had scalloped the ink, but not enough to hide the meaning. Caleb held it up. Jonas smiled without lips. "You're late," he said. "Not if the weather's bad," Caleb said. He could feel the island's clock in his bones now, the way wind and tide and cliff shaped the hour. He slipped the card into his pocket with the notebook where his father's name had not been allowed to live. Nora was awake, eyes swollen but clear. She looked at the dog first, then at Caleb, then at the ocean. "You're bleeding," she said. "It'll hold," he said. "Why didn't you finish it?" Her eyes flicked at Jonas, then back. "Because there are men who turn quiet into a weapon," Caleb said, "and men who keep it so other people can rest. I'm trying to remember which one I am." Ranger leaned his shoulder into Caleb's leg, as if to answer for him. His amber gaze was steady, regretless. He knew nothing about Aegis or Lockheed or erased names. He knew what a life owed another life when the smoke cleared. Caleb squeezed the dog's neck and stood. "We carry Evan to the beach," he said. "We use the morning skip and try the radio at the waterline. If it holds, we get a bird in the air before that tender sniffs the cove." Nora nodded, practical even with grief in the room. "And if it doesn't hold?" "Then I make my own noise," he said. They moved like a small, deliberate machine. Caleb slung Evan across his shoulders with the rope harness he trusted more than promises. Nora gathered the lean things that mattered: journal, water, the kindness she wore like work. Ranger scouted 20 yards out, reading the air, leaving a thread of presence that Caleb followed through the understory. Jonas watched them from the log, not angry now, calculating in the empty way men get when they realize the world will go on without their plan. The trail down to the South Cove was steep enough to teach humility. Sunlight found them in shards through the canopy. When they broke to the beach, the tide was breathing in, laying fresh foam along the line like handwriting that wiped itself. The Cessna rode the swell as if bored. Caleb keyed the radio, knuckles white. "Bar Harbor, this is November 5185 Kilo South Cove. 2 survivors in need of immediate evac. 1 hostile restrained at inland coordinate. 2nd vessel expected at 400 hours, South Beacon." He waited in the bowing hush, static. Then a voice, calm, human, closing the distance. 85 Kilo Bar Harbor. We copy. Jayhawk spinning in 8 minutes. Hold position. Mark hostile. Repeat last on the 2nd vessel. He read it again. The words tasted like rescue. Nora sat on the sand with her face in her hands and let herself breathe for the first time as a choice. Evan slept through salvation because that's what bodies do when the price has been paid in advance. Caleb lowered him to a blanket, adjusted the rope, retied once, making sure he would not roll if the swell spoke rude. Ranger stood with his chest to the sea breeze, nose lifted. The dog's eyes closed, opened, closed, the way animals pray. The chopper came as a growing thrum that made the cliff throw back sound like light, bright orange and white against the gray morning, lowering, lowering. Sand lifted in sheets, men in helmets and calm voices, the cables whine, hands that knew how to move sleeping weight without waking it. Nora kissed the back of Evan's hand, stood, climbed. She looked back, mouth shaping something like thank you. "And I see you both at once." The door slid. The bird rose. The thrum diluted, then left, taking 2 lives and leaving 3 behind. Silence set down again. Not empty this time. Clean, like a table wiped and set. Caleb looked at Ranger. The dog looked back, that blunt, honest face carrying 1,000 years of work without complaint. On the trail above the beach, the rope around a fallen log held a man who would breathe a long time and listen to a kind of quiet he had earned. Caleb's pocket, a plastic card, said a boat would come for a rendezvous that wouldn't go as planned. He untied the plane. The line slipped off the cleat and fell into the water with a small, exact sound. A gull sketched a white parenthesis against the sky and went on. Ranger placed 1 paw in the shallows. Tiny sparks answered where he touched, the sea alive with a thin dusting of bioluminescence left over from the night, faint but there, a constellation broken and reassembled under the skin of water. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head, felt the steady engine there, the one that had pulled him out of the worst kind of quiet and set him back into the world. "We keep going," he said. The tide breathed, the light rose. A line of blue beyond the headland promised weather that would make bad men late, and the island, which had held so much silence for so long, gave back a sound that meant morning. Night had given the island back, piece by piece. The pines turned from iron to charcoal, the cove from ink to metal, the air from breath you borrowed to breath you could afford. Caleb worked with the care of a man tying up what a storm had ripped. He cleaned the crescent wound under his ribs again, retaped it with steady fingers, and then turned to Ranger. The dog held still the way soldiers stand for medals, chin up, eyes on the horizon, while Caleb changed the wrap on the matted shoulder. When he finished, Ranger leaned his weight into him for 1 brief second, a physical amen. They built a low camp behind the last dune of the South Beach. Driftwood made a windbreak, mylar a roof, a trench a line the tide wouldn't cross yet. Nora sat wrapped to the throat, the sea printing and erasing itself in front of her. She had the look of people who have stopped moving and discovered what their bodies had been carrying. When she finally spoke, it was to the open water. "They were never rescuers," she said. "Jonas and the others, they watched the weather for boats in trouble. The SOS..." She laughed once, a sound that hated itself. They called it free bait. If the Coast Guard came, they'd take the boat and the gear from the people who'd be busy lifting us out. They had a beacon. It told them when the tender would run the South Channel, they were going to board the tender too. She blinked hard, and the tears went sideways in the wind. Evan? He cut Jonas with a file and ran them into the rocks. He kept them from our radios. He died for it. Caleb listened and did not correct her with the helicopter's brief promise. He had asked for a patch of silence so a medic could work. The patch had not held. Bar Harbor had radioed back during the refuel, voice flat with the thing voices learn when they deliver bad news too often. Septic shock took him en route. The words had been small and clean and complete. They had left a larger quiet behind. He stood, took the oiled jacket they'd found under the fir boughs, heavy with salt and the last of a man's heat, and carried it to the waterline where the beach fell away slow. Ranger followed, not heel close, but with the gravity of a friend attending a duty. Caleb dug with his hands until the wet sand tried to be stone and then yielded. He set the jacket in the shallow grave like laying down a flag he hadn't been allowed to carry, palmed sand over it until a low barrow rose. Ranger approached and set his head on the mound as if to keep it from washing away. "For the ones we didn't get to," Caleb said, the wind taking the words and not arguing with them, "and for the ones who bought us a little time." He did not know whether he meant Evan Ellis, the boy with the metal puzzle, or a name struck through on letterhead. He knew the prayer landed in the same place either way. Nora made a sound you could mishear as agreement. "He would have liked your dog," she said, and the ketotet. Smallest smile crossed her face like a bird shadow. He used to say loyalty isn't about staying. It's about standing where you should. Caleb looked at Ranger, at the blunt, honest face that had told him when to hold fire and when to make the world louder. The dog watched him back with the kind of attention that doesn't forgive or flatter. 2 lives, 1 sentence. They waited for the hour the tender's note card had promised the sea, 0400, and the sea waited back. The south beacon stood a quarter-mile down the curve of sand, a low iron post with a horn that coughed its sorrow when fog was law. Caleb checked the plastic access card again. Aegis Maritime, temporary, frequency table, rendezvous ink scalloped by salt. He slid it back into the notebook that carried diagrams of bowls of quiet and a line in pencil that said, if deployed commercially, this becomes a weapon. "You don't have to do this," Nora said. "I do," he said, and couldn't explain. He gathered the pieces that made a message, 1 flare, the cigar tin badge with Arthur Dane's photo, the Lockheed folders wrapped in wax paper, the map that put this island's cliff in a scientist's hand. He tied Jonas to a drift log with enough rope to hold 3 bad decisions. He wrote a single word in the damp sand with a stick and then scrubbed it away with his boot because it was for him, not for them. Stay. The tender came late, which meant no one aboard had ever loved a tide chart. It slipped in with deck lights low, hull painted an honest work blue, name stenciled cheap enough to peel. Mariah. 2 silhouettes at the bow, 1 at the wheelhouse, posture relaxed in the way of men arriving for routine. Ranger rose to stand without a sound. Nora's hand found the mylar blanket like a flag she didn't want to carry either. Caleb walked down the hard, wet sand until he stood where the beacon's shadow ended. He didn't wave, he didn't hide. He struck the flare and held it high. Red wrote itself in his face and on the undersides of the low clouds. The men on the tender stiffened in a choreography any soldier recognized from far away. The head tilt, the split of roles. One watches, one pretends nothing's changed, one's hand goes to where a weapon lives. They cut the engine and let the swell slide them in. A man in his 50s came to the rail. He had the kind of good haircut sharks wear. He didn't query the VHF. He measured. "You're not my deckhand," he said. "No," Caleb said. "You're early." The man's eyes took the flare's light and made it look like he'd invented it. He wasn't Jonas. He didn't need anyone to clap. "We have a service contract," he said. "You're trespassing on an aid to navigation." Caleb opened the cigar tin and held up the laminated badge. Arthur Dane, systems contractor. The face on the plastic and the face on the deck read, as brothers, not twins. Caleb didn't care which. "You're late," he said, evenly. "And you're done." The man smiled without changing his heart rate. "Who are you?" Someone who read the drawings, Caleb said. He set the flare in the sand. It hissed and burned clean. He laid the waxed photo of 4 men on the beach. He spoke like he was telling the tide its plan. You built a bowl of quiet into this cliff. You sold it as research. Aegis leased the maintenance and the secrecy. Smugglers learned to sail into the dead spot, drag women into boats, and wait for the tender that comes when everybody else's radio dies. He held up the access card between forefinger and thumb. Then you wrote the schedule on a card you didn't think anyone would find. The man on the rail didn't blink. He watched a gull cross behind Caleb's shoulder. You think you can stand in the way of commerce? Caleb stepped aside just enough to open his silhouette. Ranger stepped forward exactly as far, filling the space with a gray, unmovable fact. Not commerce, Caleb said. Consequence. The tender's engine coughed, a man at the wheel touching the throttle without thinking. Ranger's lip lifted 1 millimeter and dropped, an animal punctuation mark that altered the sentence. Caleb heard rotor thump before the men on the deck looked up. The Jayhawk came in lower than a secret, orange and white, somehow brighter in dawn than in any noon. Its rotor wash pinned the flare's smoke to the sand like a hand. Loudspeakers did what loudspeakers do. United States Coast Guard. Hold position. The tender's crew moved through the 5 motions men make when a plan goes hollow. Denial, insult, inventory, panic, bargain. Arthur Dane, or his avatar, kept his hands on the rail and turned his face into the wind like the smell didn't belong to him. When the rib slapped off the helicopter's sling and men in helmets hit the surf at a run, he didn't run. He had the good taste to look at the Lockheed folder on the sand and the bad taste to smile. Your father was brilliant, he said conversationally, as 2 petty officers took the ladder. He refused to put his name on something the government would bury. We put our name on it and saved his work from a file cabinet. You saved nothing, Caleb said. He tamped the flare into the sand with his boot. You sold quiet to men who needed a place to hurt other people without being heard. Dane's eyes flicked to Ranger. And you bring a dog to a contract dispute. I bring a witness to character, Caleb said. Handcuffs made the tidy clicks they always make. Rights were read into the wind. On the dune behind, Jonas, storm-blown hair, rope-bit wrists, watched with a rage flat enough to pour. The Coast Guard boat took him like it took Dane, efficiently, without drama, like men sweeping a floor. Nora stepped down the beach with the careful steps of someone relearning ground. She didn't look at the men going. She looked at the mound of sand where the oiled jacket lay and put her palm on it, like you do when doors close on trains and you want to feel the motion you can't follow. He would have liked this, she said softly. Caleb exhaled and felt something old leave with the breath, not guilt. Guilt has roots. Not grief. Grief rents the room and lives there. Something else. The superstition that you must fail again because you failed once. He didn't feel lighter. He felt aligned. Ranger nosed the stick Caleb had used to write in the sand and carried it over, set it on the barrow, and lay down with his head across both. It was not ceremony. It looked like one. The helicopter lifted and became weather. The tender, now piloted by a petty officer with a haircut earned the hard way, idled seaward. The beacon coughed its useless horn into a morning that didn't need it. The island listened to itself and sounded like a place again. Caleb stood with the notebook under his arm, the one that had diagrams and erasures and a hand that wasn't famous writing ethics into margins, and looked from the grave of a good jacket to the dog who had taught him how to keep a shot in a holster. There are people who fight all their lives, he said. Not to Nora, not to Ranger, not to anyone in particular, not to be remembered, but to let other people forget. The tide was coming in. It would wipe his footprints first, then the flare scorch, then the shallow lines of the ropes he'd tied. It would reach the barrow and push at it, ask it what it was for. The dune grass lifted its narrow flags and said yes to the wind. Ranger rose and leaned his shoulder into Caleb's leg. They turned together, 2 lines, same direction, and walked up from the water, leaving the torch-black circle cooling on the sand and the morning widening like a door. Morning arrived like a promise kept slowly. A thin silver line opened at the seam of the sea and the sky, and the island, which had learned to hold its breath, finally let it go. The pines stood rinsed and straight. The cove wore its usual iron. Gulls stitched white thread through the new light. The wind had traded its hard consonants for vowels. Smoke from the dead flare left no sentence behind. The Jayhawk came back as a distant thrum, then a presence, then a hovering sun with painted wings. Sand lifted and rattled the dune grass, helmets and calm voices again. Nora stepped from the lee of the driftwood windbreak with deliberate steps, the mylar blanket folded like a flag over her arm. She wore the face of someone who has held a vigil and been released by dawn. She found Caleb's eyes, held them, and in that quiet exchange they signed everything that could be signed without ink: gratitude, grief, permission to keep going. "You should come," one of the crewmen said through the rotor wash. "Get that looked at." He gestured at the bandaged line under Caleb's ribs. Caleb shook his head. "I'll be behind you," he said, and the words meant later, not never. "There are things to set right while the tide's with me." Nora stepped close, the chopper's wind tugging her hair toward the sea. "He'd have liked you," she said over the noise. "Your husband was the brave one," Caleb said. "Bravery's a chain," she answered. "Somebody holds the next link." She put a hand on Ranger's head, fingers disappearing into the thick fur. "You keep him honest," she told the dog. Ranger's eyes softened in a way only dogs manage without blinking. Then she climbed, and the door slid, and the machine lifted, and for a moment a blade of sun fell through the rotor arc and laid a bright line across the black rock like a benediction. When the helicopter shrank to a dot the sky would keep, the island returned to the simple work of being. The horn at the south beacon coughed once and remembered it wasn't needed. Far offshore, the tender, now driven by a haircut with a lawful soul, pointed its bow toward a harbor where papers waited for signatures and names would be typed where they'd been missing. Caleb crouched beside a patch of sand that didn't wave like the rest. The low barrow of wet grit where the oiled jacket lay had held the night. He smoothed a dune grass frond across it, a green line, living, a small defiant vein. Ranger lay down with his chest to the mound and rested his muzzle there as if listening for an engine. The dog's breath moved the sand by grains. This too was a ceremony, unofficial, unsanctioned, binding. He dug a shallow second hollow and set the waxed photograph inside. 4 men before a chain-link fence, a chalkboard drawing of a cliff and a wave, a star that wasn't a star on a jacket sleeve, a young face with a tie that wouldn't behave. He covered the edges with shells and a flat gray stone. He didn't mark it otherwise. The island would remember. The work left to do was quiet work, evidence ordered for hands that needed order, a map folded so a young petty officer could later unfold it and find the exact notch in the cliff that turned radios to ghosts, a cigar tin with a laminated badge tucked under a coil of rope so a prosecutor could hold it up to a light and say the word proven. He stacked the Lockheed papers in a dry bag with the notebook that had made margin notes into a code of conduct, and in the place where a name had been struck through, he wrote another line in pencil. Silence is a tool. Decide who wields it. It was not an apology for his father, it was a continuation. Ranger shifted and pressed his flank to Caleb's knee, a weight that said you are here more reliably than language. Caleb scratched behind one upright ear, the dog's eyes half closed in a way that looked like prayer. They walked the south beach until the path cut inland. The forest let them in with the courtesy of a house that has been aired. Spruce shadows moved like water on rock. Caleb's steps found the places his boots had already taught the ground. He passed the spot where Jonas had learned that mercy didn't always look like forgiveness, just like consequence didn't always look like fire. The drift log where he'd tied the man bore grooves where rope had worried wood. Sand had already started to fill them. The world, as always, chose to move toward smooth. Up on the ridge, the boathouse waited in its old posture, tin roof bowed, door chained, salt-making lace of every fastener. He eased the chain free and let the room breathe. He stood at the workbench with the dented steel drawers and set the dry bag down as if the wood could feel weight and intention. He slid the unlabeled drawer open and returned the notebook to its original dark. Then, because the living deserved a ledger as much as the dead, he took the photograph of the 4 men and taped a copy to the inside of the cabinet door, level and neat, a private memorial in a place tyrannized by weather. He found a grease pencil and drew a small circle on the map where the bowl of quiet began and ended, then wrote under the circle, decommissioned. He didn't know if that was true yet. He knew it could be. Back outside, the day had set its shoulders under the sun. The black faces of the rocks shone like wet seal hide. A lone cormorant stood on a spur with its wings outstretched, drying itself, a dark cruciform that looked more liturgy than bird. Caleb and Ranger sat on a flat, warm stone and ate the last of a ration bar with the reverence of people who know where food ends and appetite begins. He gave Ranger the bigger piece, and the dog refused at the first offer, as always, to keep the covenant, and took it at the second, as always, to keep the friendship. "Do you remember Kunar?" Caleb asked softly, eyes on the line where the ocean polished the earth. Ranger flicked an ear, as is, if to say remembering wasn't the point. The point was that they had walked away from the ridge this time and down into the valley where the voices were. They had been on the right side of distance. He closed his eyes and found the radio hiss that used to own his nights. He opened them and found only surf and bird and the small percussion of sail threads on some impossible boat far away. The quiet didn't press. It accepted. He tried a sentence out loud that had once tasted like rust and now, almost, tasted like clean water. "We did it, boy," he said. "This time, we came back." Ranger looked up into his face and then away, scanning the line of trees, the bald shoulder of the cliff, the trail where a man might come and shouldn't. This, too, was a benediction. By afternoon, the Coast Guard rib returned with a pair of civilians in Noe windbreakers and a boxy device that blinked like a patient heart. They shook his hand and asked smart questions, the kind you only ask when you've read the homework. He walked them to the cliff cup and showed them where the world went mute. They nodded, made notes, took measurements, spoke of decommissioning orders and liability and the funny way money forgot ethics when salt got under the paint. One of them, gray at the temples, lingered at the boathouse door and looked a long time at the taped photo. "Somebody wanted this remembered," the man said. "Somebody needed it," Caleb answered. They took the dry bag and promised receipts and chain of custody and a call to a number he didn't give them, but that would still find him. He watched them go without the old worry that handing things to other people meant abdication. This, he understood now, was also a link in the chain. You lift, then you pass. Evening came in low and gold and kind. The wind fell away to a cool hand. He built a small, respectful fire in a pit of stones and sat with Ranger on the quiet side of it, sharing heat and the idea of supper more than supper itself. He carved a stick to a simple point and then blunted it because sharpness wasn't needed. He considered the Cessna bobbing like a patient animal in its tie and considered the weight of the mainland, a cabin that knew his footsteps, a coat hook that had memorized his field jacket, a radio on a shelf that didn't always need to be on. He spoke aloud without embarrassment because the island had taught him the art of honest conversation with no reply. "I don't have to stay forever to stand watch," he said. "I can go and come back. I can leave the right kind of quiet in my place." Ranger sneezed softly at a coal spark and laid his head on Caleb's boot. The dog's eyes reflected the fire until they looked like small planets. A star came on above the south beacon and then another. The horn stayed still. Far offshore, the night inked itself in with care, as if it had learned something from the day. They doused the fire when the log became a long red thought. On. The walk to the waterline. The sand made the dry squeak. It makes only when the world has cooled enough to hear small truths. He untied the Cessna, stowed the line, checked the fuel with the practiced unnecessary rhythm of a man reciting a prayer by heart. Ranger hopped up, turned twice, settled with a sigh that sounded like finally and again at once. Caleb didn't start the engine yet. He let the plane rock and spoke to the air that had been a wall and was now a room. "Someone will come to anchor a marker here," he said. "Someone will write a report. Somebody else will make a call that changes a map. And a woman in a town far away will light a candle and not know why she can breathe easier." He smiled at the dark water. "That's how it's supposed to work." A slit opened in the cloud, and a long, pale blade of moonlight found the exact stones of the barrow and the green frond laid across it and made them briefly bright. The jacket's grave, the living line, the witness dog, the man who had carried one more link. The beam held a breath and then moved on, climbing the cliff, glancing off the tin roof of a humble boathouse, rimming the pines in cold fire, and finally lifting out to sea where a tender went small under the weight of consequence. Caleb touched Ranger's ear with 2 fingers. The dog leaned his whole head into the touch like a burden set down. The engine took and filled the morning with music on its second turn. The plane gathered itself, slid free of the sand's hand, and came up onto its own. He banked once over the South Cove, tipped a wing to the Barrow, to the Beacon, to the bolt-hole boathouse with its taped photograph and its newly labeled circle. The island shrank. The horizon widened. The light, that thin, faithful blade, stayed with them longer than physics suggested it should, laying a track on the water that looked for a few beautiful seconds, like a road you could keep forever. In a world so quick to forget, stories like this remind us of what endures: loyalty, love, and quiet courage. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in the good that remains. Subscribe to join us beneath the same wide sky, where hope still whispers in the wind. May God bless you, and may your heart always find its way home.